Hi, welcome back to Introduction to Embodied Cognitive Science. So previously we saw how there's a way to understand the history of psychology, the history of cognitive science, the history of the sciences of the mind in general, as uh, comprising two different traditions, two different ways of thinking about the phenomena that we study, about mind, about behavior, about cognition, right? There's a tradition that can be described as internalist, mechanist, structuralist, computationalist, functionalist in one sense of the term. And then there's a different tradition that can be described as constructivist, naturalist, functionalist in a different sense, dynamicist, relational. Right? We saw how there are different versions of embodied cognition, different approaches that use that label, embodied cognition, embodied cognitive science. But there's one that's what we're focusing on, which is what can be described as radical embodied cognitive science. And it's this version, this approach that follows from a constructivist understanding to explanation of psychological phenomena. It's a version that adopts a naturalistic approach that tries to understand the function of mind, what mind is for, not the structure of mind. So it adopts a dynamical way of understanding mental phenomena, a relational approach to understanding mind and cognition and behavior. And so uh, in the next few weeks, right, from now on until the end of the course, we're going to be focusing on this tradition and specifically um, the work that's currently being done uh, under this umbrella of radical embodied cognitive science. And we'll be looking at two different varieties of research within radical embodied cognitive science. So the inactive approach and the ecological approach. Our focus today, this week, is on the inactive approach. Next week, we're going to focus on the ecological approach, even though I've said a couple of things already about the ecological approach, but we'll then um, dig more deeply there. Um, and that's the goal for the next 2 weeks. For the current week and the following one, we're going to in the lecture series we'll get a sense of how these approaches, the inactive and the ecological approach, work, and then we start the seminar series where we'll be discussing more in-depth topics and questions that arise within radical embodied cognitive science. So again, our focus today is the inactive approach, and a way to get started thinking about it is to think about this question: what do you know? I know it seems like a huge question. What do I even mean about when I ask that, right? So um, let's think of this version of the question. Do we have knowledge of the external world, right? When we do scientific psychology, cognitive science, um, do we describe cognitive systems as having knowledge of an external world? A straightforward answer to this question is to say yes, cognitive systems have knowledge of the external world. That's a realist perspective. The idea is that there are things happening in the world, and so you see there children playing soccer, and there's a bird flying, and a dog is around, and the cognitive system has some knowledge of that external world. It may be that the you know the in the image here you see the dog is accurately represented for the cognitive system. The cognitive system is not, it seems, having an accurate access, perceptual access to the bird, and maybe the bird flew too fast. This person here, the thinker, didn't attend to it, or maybe there's some reason why the bird is not, you know, represented to the within the cognitive system as having the properties that it actually has. In this case, it's blue, but it's perceived as yellow. It's represented internally as yellow. But so at least some of our knowledge, at least some of our experience, does correspond to the way that reality is, to the way that the world really is, and that's a realist stance. Um, Now, there are different ways of rejecting this realist stance. One reaction to this realist stance is to say that we don't have knowledge of the external world because really all there is our representations. All that we can know is the ideas and thoughts that we have. And so you have thoughts of birds and dogs. Um, so you could be an idealist and even move a step further and become a solipsist. Solipsism is the idea that only your mind exists. If you're a solipsist, you believe that the only thing you can be sure of is your own mental states, right? And this thinker here is thinking, maybe I'm the only thing that exists. And I have ideas and thoughts, but there's nothing that they correspond to. This is a radical kind of idealism. But researching cognitive science can be and has been described as adopting a version of solipsism. That's something that Jerry Fodor, a philosopher of cognitive science, um, describes and embraces as a kind of methodological solipsism. The idea here is that uh, when we do psychological science, when we do cognitive science, any science of the mind, the only states and processes that are relevant for us scientifically are mental states. States of the world, of the external world, are irrelevant because our science is about these internal states. So methodologically, it's as if nothing existed outside of the cognitive system because we're interested in understanding the inner workings of cognitive systems, right? And so this can be seen as a kind of idealism, right? Not necessarily saying that there's no external world, but only that when we are trying to understand the workings of a cognitive system, that external world is irrelevant. It's outside the scope of consideration because really what matters for us is the inner workings of the cognitive system itself. It's what happens within the cognitive system, right? Input output is not as relevant as the processes, the computational transformations that happen within the cognitive system. So that's a way of rejecting a realist perspective that we have experience of an external world, or that our knowledge is made up by the external world, or that there's some correspondence between our thoughts and representations and the external world. Because ultimately, from this perspective, it doesn't matter. What matters is the content, these representational vehicles that we have, and how they are used to um, to generate behavior, how they are manipulated and computed for the working of the cognitive system itself. And that's what we can know and what we can talk about from the perspective of the cognitive scientist. Now, enactivism rejects both views. Enactivism rejects realism, but um, it doesn't accept the idealist rejection of realism. Both that realist stance and idealism are concerned with the match between our perceptions, our thoughts, and an independent world, right? Realists are saying that our perceptions and thoughts do match the independent world, the external world, at least in some cases, right? Maybe not all cases, but at least in some cases, the realists will say we accurately perceive the world. At least in some cases, our thoughts correspond to things in the world. And the idealist is rejecting that perspective. But so that means that both realists and idealists focus on representations, and there being an internal and external divide. There being a separation between the inside and the outside, between the subject and the object of knowledge, the knowing subject and the things that are known. So enactivism rejects both perspectives here. For enactivists, we bring forth a world. That's an important phrase that they use. For enactivists, we bring forth a world, and we do that through embodied action. So there's no sense in which we experience or have knowledge of a world independent of ourselves, a world independent of our activity. We come to understand the world through our activity. And our access to the world is limited. It's constrained by the sorts of activities that we can engage in, the sorts of um, uh, of perception and action that we can perform. So ultimately, this results in an approach to understanding cognitive systems in which it doesn't make sense to think in terms of an internal and external divide, right? There isn't a separation between an inside and outside, or the knowing subject and the external world, right? So inactivism moves away from thinking in terms of an independent environment and an independent uh, subject or organism, and right, and then worrying about how the internal representations that this organism has of the external world, how they match one another, right? And activists will say, no, through our embodied activity, we bring forth a world, our world, right? And that may be different for different organisms, different ways of life, different forms of life bring forth different worlds. So that's what we're going to try to understand today. What is being claimed here? What is the basis for thinking this way? And what do we get out of it? But previously, I showed this slide to you, and in the context of thinking about that version of embodied cognition that describes cognition as distributed or extended, right? The extended mind, wide computationalism, and other views that describe cognition as distributed. And activists criticize this kind of view by saying that it's not radical enough, if you recall, right? Some people criticize the extended mind and wide computationalism, saying that they are too radical, but for inactivism, they aren't radical enough. And there's this quote by Ezequiel de Paulo and his colleagues in their 2017 book, Sensorimotor Life. They say, the extended mind hypothesis and other variants of embodied functionalism, they are elaborations and updates of cognitivism, in the sense that while in practice the body matters, it still plays second fiddle to the algorithmic nature of cognition, which remains its undisputed essence. So the body comes to play a role in these views, but it's not as central. It's not as important as cognition itself, which is to be understood in algorithmic terms, in computational terms. So the body participates in the computation, um, but cognition itself is best understood algorithmically. And De Paulo and colleagues say here, compared to the extended mind and distributed cognition, a different reaction to the lessons of embodied criticisms. Criticisms such as the ones raised by Hubert Dreyfus, John Searle, by work in evolutionary robotics, right? Different reaction to the lessons we learn from this body of work involves the suspicion that something more fundamental is at stake than merely a reform of functionalism. Admitting of a more central role for the active living body is a way of questioning the supposed informational essence of cognition. So when we recognize that the body is a living thing and it's active, right? When we recognize the central role that the body plays in cognition, then that enables us to question this understanding of cognition as being essentially informational, a matter of information processing, right? Which is a computational metaphor. So you've seen this quote before, right? So continuing, now it's the part that you haven't seen. We get to a brief overview of the inactive alternative, what this alternative path proposes. So De Paulo and colleagues say here, instead of understanding cognition as a computer-like process, inactivism starts by considering it as a lifelike process, anchored in the living body. So in a way, it's moving away from a vision for cognitive science that's inspired by computer science toward a vision of cognitive science that is inspired by biological science. Cognition, then, is understood not so much as a computer-like process, but more like a life-like process. They say instead of being merely a surrogate for the mind, a container, a vehicle, or instrument controlled by the brain. Even one that could implement clever computational functions. The body, the living and the lived body, the material and the experiencing body. The body is conceived as the source of all that the mind is and can be. So the body, they're saying, is not just relegated to the level of implementation, right? And you could even say that the body implements very sophisticated computational processes. But they're saying, um, instead of thinking of the body in that way, the body as a living and lived body, right? It's conceived as then, as they say, the source of all that the mind is and can be, not just the implementation of some processes or anything like that. So the body comes to take on a more central role. They continue. This alternative take on embodiment goes deeper into the nature of the body, its organismic and ecological roots, and its self-organizing properties, in order to project a new foundation for thinking about the mind. The enactive approach, they say, entails a conception of the body not as a machine, but as a precarious, self-individuating network of processes involved in multiple cycles of regulation. The enactive approach provides an attempt to ground cognition using categories that describe the organization of living systems. And so here you already get to see some of the keywords for enactivists, right? They're talking about this, the body and cognitive systems as being self-organizing systems. There's a there's a sense in which the living systems, cognitive systems, are precarious and they are self-individuating, and that in order to understand cognition properly, we need to understand the organization of living systems. So this is what Di Paolo and colleagues are claiming to be, central to the enactive approach. All of these ideas and the enactive approach, as you will find it today in the cognitive science literature, originate from the ideas of Humberto Maturana and Francisco Varela. These are two researchers from Chile who have, the foundation of their work is in biology, in theoretical biology, um, and and their research, they started a research group, and that led to developments that culminate in what we now know as the enactive approach, even though that's not a term that they used initially. They weren't talking about inaction or anything like that. But it all really starts with their work in Chile in the 60s, 70s, 80s especially. So there's this book that they published in 1980 titled Autopoiesis and Cognition, The Realization of the Living. As I said, the book is published in 1980 in the English version, written by Maturana and Varela. But the book has two parts. The first part is fully written by Maturana, and that was actually written in 1970. And so the first part of the book is titled Biology of Cognition. And this is one of the first places where Maturana describes a new way of thinking of cognition from a biological perspective. Interestingly, right, so this is in the context of working cybernetics and other ideas that were in the air at the time in the 60s, so his writing in 1970. And the approach to this biological approach to cognition then doesn't mean a physiological approach, right? But it's an approach to cognition thinking in terms of living systems. So systems thinking, right? How can we understand cognition from a biological perspective that favors an understanding of organisms as living systems? This is the first part of the book. The second part is then co-authored by Maturana and Varela, and that was written in 1973. And that's called Autopoiesis, the Organization of the Living. That's the first place where they use the term autopoiesis, which is a central term for the enactive approach, and it's something that we'll talk about later. And so here then they develop further the framework that they're proposing for understanding cognition in terms of the organization of living things. the organization of living systems. So that's the second part. And again, the first written in 1970, the second written in 1973. The book is published in Spanish around a little after that, and then the English version that I have that I'm showing you here is only published then in 1980. And in the beginning, the part that Maturana writes is saying that in the context of starting this work, he was looking for a new language to talk about the phenomena of perception and cognition. He needed a new approach, new way of thinking about these phenomena. And, and he identified then two questions that are related to this new language, new framework, new approach to the phenomena of perception and cognition. The first question is how does the organism obtain information about its environment? And what he proposes is that this is not really the best question to ask when we're studying cognitive systems, when we're studying perception and cognition as biological phenomena, right? So instead of asking how does the organism obtain information about its environment, he proposes that we change that question to the following question: how does it happen that the organism has the structure that permits it to operate adequately in the medium in which it exists, right? So you see that this can be described as a change in paradigm, right? It's a change in the way that we describe the world. It's a change in the way that we describe the phenomena that we're studying. The traditional question was, how does the organism obtain information about the environment? And he's saying, instead, let's ask this other question that's more appropriate for a biological um, um, systems perspective on cognition, right? How does it happen that the organism has the structure that allows it, enables it to operate adequately in its environment? And say, so this shift requires the actual attempt to describe the phenomena that take place in the organism during the occurrence of the phenomena of perception and cognition. And, and so this required attending and focusing on what actually happens. Do these things work? How do perception and cognition work for actual living organisms? And to understand that, to approach these phenomena in a language, they say, in a language that retained them, these phenomena, as phenomena proper to a closed nervous system, right? So instead of describing the phenomena of perception and cognition in a language that's not specific to them as biological phenomena, right? That would be, for example, describing the phenomena of perception and cognition in a language of computation. That's not the language that concerns the organization and working of organisms, right? So they're saying, how can we understand then the phenomena of perception and cognition as biological phenomena in a language that is appropriate for understanding biological phenomena? So that's what that's the background of the motivation for the project that they begin. And so then in this book and in all of the work that comes from this starting point in the 1980 book, there are a number of key ideas and concepts, and some of which I already mentioned, right? Autopoiesis is one, autonomy, operational closure, structural coupling, emergence, sense making, and bringing forth a world. These are all key ideas that you find in the enactive approach to cognitive science. Um, but all of these depend on a more fundamental distinction that Maturana and Varela propose in this book already, which is the distinction between system and observer. All of these key ideas and concepts depend on our understanding of the basic fundamental distinction between observers and the systems that they observe. So in the first part of that book, in Biology of Cognition, Maturana says the following: the genetic and nervous systems are set to code information about the environment. And to represent that information about the environment, in their functional organization. But he says this is untenable. This is not acceptable. The genetic and nervous systems code processes that specify series of transformations from initial states, which can be decoded only through their actual implementation. Not, this is important, not descriptions that the observer makes of an environment, which lies exclusively in his cognitive domain. So we as cognitive scientists, we as researchers, are the observers. We're observing a system, right, an organism when we study behavior, when we study cognition. Um, and so when we're talking about the genetic and nervous systems, this idea that they code information about the environment and that these systems represent that information in their function organization is something that belongs only to the domain of our descriptions, but it doesn't make um, a lot of sense as descriptions of what is actually happening within the system for the system. So he gives an illustration of the problem. He says, let us suppose that we want to build 2 houses. For such a purpose, we hire 2 groups of 13 workers each. We name one of the workers of the first group as the group leader, and we give him a book which contains all the plans of the house, showing in a standard way the layout of walls, water pipes, electric connections, windows, etc., plus several views in perspective of the finished house. The workers study the plans, and under the guidance of the leader, they construct the house, approximating continuously the final state prescribed by the description. In the second group, we do not name a leader. We only arrange the workers in a starting line in the field and give each of them a book, the same book for all, containing only neighborhood instructions. These instructions do not contain words such as house, pipes, or windows, nor do they contain drawings or plans or the house to be constructed. They contain only instructions of what a worker should do in each of the different positions and in the different relations in which he finds himself as his position and relations change. The end result in both cases is the same, namely a house. The workers of the first group, however, construct something whose final appearance they know all the time, while the workers of the second group have no views of what they are building, nor do they need to have obtained them, even when they are finished. For the observer, both groups are building a house, and he knows it from the start. But the house that the second group builds lies only in his cognitive domain. The house built by the first group, however, is also in the cognitive domain of the workers. The coding is obviously different in the 2 cases. In fact, the instructions contained in the book given to the first group clearly code the house as the observer would describe it, and the decoding task of the workers consists in purposefully doing things that will approximate to the construction of the described final state. This is why the house must be in their cognitive domain. In the second case, the instructions contained in each of the 13 identical books do not code a house. They code a process that constitutes a path of changing relationships, which, if carried through under certain conditions, results in a system with a domain of interactions which has no intrinsic relationship with the beholding observer. That the observer should call this system a house is a feature of his cognitive domain, not of the system itself. In the first case, the coding is isomorphic with a description of the house by the observer, and in fact constitutes a representation of it. In the second case, it is not. The first case is typical of the way in which the observer codes the systems that he builds. The second corresponds to the way that the genome and nervous system constitute codes for the organism and for behavior, respectively. And one would never find in these codes any isomorphism with the description that the observer would make of the resultant systems with which he interacts. In what sense could one then say that the genetic and nervous systems code information about the environment? The notion of information refers to the observer's degree of uncertainty in his behavior within a domain of alternatives defined by him. Hence, the notion of information only applies within his cognitive domain. What one could at most say is that the genetic and nervous systems generate information through their self-specification when witnessed by the observer, as if in their progressive self-decoding into growth and behavior. So in this passage then, Matrona is drawing very strongly the distinction between the observer and the systems and the different domains that we can identify. Right? There's a domain that's specific to the systems. There's a domain that's specific to the observer of the system. So when it comes to the system itself, there's a domain of interactions. There's a domain of the interactions that happen within the system, the interactions of the system with its environment. When it comes to the observers, then there's a cognitive domain, and the cognitive domain will encompass the way that the observer describes what he sees happening in the system and its interactions. So Matrona says here, the observer beholds simultaneously the entity that he considers, an organism in our case, and the universe in which that entity lies, that is, the organism's environment. This allows the observer to interact independently with both the entity and the environment, and to have interactions that are necessarily outside the domain of interactions of the observed entity. That is, the observer is outside, right, and it's describing and observing, beholding, seeing, measuring, tracking in some way the behavior of the system and the relations that the system holds to its environment. And these interactions that the observer is observing are outside the domain of interactions of the system, right? So the observer stands in relations to the system and to its environment that are different from the relations that the system itself bears to its environment. The observer can describe an entity only if there's at least one other entity from which he can distinguish it and with which he can observe it to interact or relate. So there has to be at least one thing that the observer can differentiate from the system to say, okay, so this is the system and this other thing is not the system, right? Here, the system is the green dots that are connected to each other with a thick line, and then there's a blue dot there. At least there has to be at least one other thing that the system interacts with or bears some relation to, that the observer then can use to distinguish one from the other. That allows the observer to say, okay, so this is the system and this is not the system. And the set of all interactions into which an entity can enter is its domain of interactions. The set of all relations, that is, interactions through the observer, in which an entity can observe is its domain of relations. And this, that is the domain of relations, lies within the cognitive domain of the observer, right? So for the system itself, there's a domain of its interactions. The observer, right, seeing and identifying a system by distinguishing it from its environment, then can identify all of the relations that can exist for the system. But this is in the domain of in the cognitive domain of the observer, right? This description of the relations is something that's available to the observer. It doesn't lie within the domain of the interactions of the system. Interestingly, Maturana proposes the following. He says the observer is a human being, of course. That means that the observer is a living system. And so whatever applies to living systems applies also to him. This project that we're building of understanding living systems in a certain way from a biological perspective, then is something that should apply to the observer, who is also a living system. It says further, the observer is a living system, and an understanding of cognition as a biological phenomenon must account for the observer and his role in it. So with this distinction in place between the observer and the living system, then we can think more carefully about living systems themselves. And the key idea here is that living systems are defined by their interactions. There's a circular pattern of organization. So the interactions, right, the many interactions, all the interactions that exist for the living system, they produce the system as a unity. They provide the system's identity. These interactions make the system be what it is. Um, at the same time, the system, through its working, maintains this very organization, which means that the system maintains itself, it maintains its identity, right? So the continued operation of the system through interacting, um, the parts within the system interacting with each other in a certain way, and the system as a whole interacting with its environment, right? There's a process of differentiating, the system differentiating itself from its environment with which it interacts, and through that building its own identity as a thing on its own, right? As a unity, as a unified thing, um, that is distinct from its environment, even while interacting with it. So on living systems and interactions, they say living systems are units of interactions. They exist in an ambience, an environment. From a purely biological point of view, living systems cannot be understood independently of that part of the ambience with which they interact. That's the niche. Nor can the niche be defined independently of the living system that specifies it, right? So we could say that there's a mutuality between the two, that you can only understand the working of the living system in terms of that part, as he's saying, Matrona is saying here, the part of the ambience with which it interacts. That's the niche. But we can only understand the niche, the nature of the niche, in terms of the living system interacting with it, that the system that specifies the niche. So further, living systems as they exist on Earth today are characterized by exergonic metabolism, growth, and internal molecular replication, all organized in a closed causal circular process that allows for evolutionary change in the way the circularity is maintained, but not for the loss of the circularity itself. So this circular organization, it can change. There can be transformations, but without loss of the circularity. That's what it means for the system to stay alive, right? To continue being itself. If the circular organization was lost, then the system would cease to exist. So this circular organization constitutes a homeostatic system whose function is to produce and maintain this very same circular organization by determining that the components that specify it be those whose synthesis or maintenance it secures, right? So through its working, the system ensures that the conditions it relies on for living, for staying alive, are maintained. And so through that, this circular organization ensures that the system continues to be what it is, right? It maintains the conditions required for its continuation, which means that it preserves the identity of the system, which again is distinguished from the things it's not, from the environment it interacts with. Furthermore, the circular organization defines a living system as a unit of interactions and is essential for its maintenance as a unit. That which is not in it is external to it or does not exist. Right? Whatever is external to the circular organization might as well not exist, right? It's irrelevant for the circular organization. And so the circular organization in which the components that specify it are those whose synthesis or maintenance is secures in a manner such that the product of their functioning is the same functioning organization that produces them. This is the living organization. So to get clearer on this relation between identity and self-individuation, right, that's at play in the circular organization of life, Matrona says, It is the circularity of its organization that makes a living system a unit of interactions. And it is this circularity that it must maintain in order to remain a living system and to retain its identity through different interactions. A living system defines through its organization the domain of all interactions into which it can possibly enter without losing its identity. And it maintains its identity only as long as the basic circularity that defines it as a unit of interactions remains unbroken. Due to the circular nature of its organization, a living system has a self-referring domain of interactions. It is a self-referring system. And its condition of being a unit of interactions is maintained because its organization has functional significance only in relation to the maintenance of its circularity and defines its domain of interactions accordingly. Right? So the functioning of a living system partly defines the kinds of interactions that it can enter into. Right? And this is part of what defines the living system itself, right? The sorts of interactions it can have, and the sorts of interactions that it does have, the relations it bears to its environment, in the sense that the system is its identity comes out of the distinction that it has from the things around it, right? There are things that the system interacts with, and it's the distinction between those things that it interacts with and the things that make it up, the things that are part of the system, that give the system its identity. But there's again this circular organization. There's the living system is organized in such a way that it maintains the interactions that are beneficial to it, right? That the interactions and the processes that are that keep it alive, and through that, the system is engaged in this process of self-individuation, right? It's differentiating itself from the things it's not, these things that it interacts with. So a notion that I think can be helpful to think about here is the concept of fractals, the concept of fractality, which you can understand as a kind of scale-free self-similarity. So let's break this down. So first, self-similarity. In a sense, it can be understood as synonymous with symmetry, right? Which is invariance over transformation. So starting with these geometrical objects, right? So a sphere, a circle, you can flip in all sorts of ways, right? You can rotate it 1 degree or 90 or 180 or 200, whatever angle you rotate it, it will still maintain its identity, right? So all of these transformations, if you flip a circle horizontally or vertically, it will still be a circle. A triangle is more limited in the range of transformations over which it doesn't vary, right? If you shift the triangle a few degrees, it will not be the same object that you're looking at now. But there's a range of transformations, and you can rotate it and flip it and reverse it in some ways, and it would still be in this case, this equilateral triangle in the orientation that it has. So these are the symmetries of these geometric objects, right? There are the self-similarities, the ways in which these objects remain themselves over a range of transformations. And many living things they have this kind of bilateral symmetry. Human faces are roughly symmetrical in this way, right? Though not entirely, but so symmetry can be seen as there's a range, there's a degree of symmetry. It's not symmetrical or not. There are types of symmetry and degrees of symmetry, but many living organisms will typically have this kind of bilateral symmetry, where if you fold it in the middle and you reproduce the one side against it, the result will be very close to the organism as it is. So the bilateral symmetry needs to be right in the middle in this kind of section, right? If you divide in half with a horizontal line, then you won't that transformation won't preserve the identity of this organism. And then there are other examples. These are ways in which over some transformations, right, that symmetry can be preserved, or the self-similarity can be preserved. And these are spatial. So fractality concerns self-similarity that's not dependent on scales, right? So not only spatially, like the mirror image of a geometrical object, or the fly or an organism or something like that, but it's self-similarity over transformations in scale. And so these are some of the usual types of examples you may have seen of fractals. And so these are mathematical objects. And as you zoom in, they are structured in such a way that as you zoom in, you end up with the same object that you started with. And you can keep zooming in indefinitely, because they are structured in such a way that independently of the scale you're looking at, you have a similar system, right? So this is a transformation not simply in space, right, as the previous examples, but this is a transformation in scale. Now, it's important to see that not everything is fractal, right? So the circle we saw previously, it is invariant over some transformations, but it's not fractal, because it's that invariance is not scale free. It's not independent of scale. And if you zoom in the circle, and that's what the image is illustrating there, if you zoom in the circle, what you end up with is not a circle. It's that slope, right? It's that line, curved line. Car that's the other example. If you zoom in a bit of the car, you don't end up with a car, right? You end up with a part of the car, and it's a different thing. So these objects lose their identity over transformations in scale. And then there's the silly example, the dog, right? It's not fractal in that sense, that you zoom in to his ear and you end up with a dog, right? So not everything is fractal, but many things are. Importantly, living systems tend to be fractal in some aspects. Some aspects of living systems can be fractal. So this is an artificial example, of course, but it suggests the ways in which there can be symmetry within a system over transformations of scale. So there's this tree, and when considered as a whole, there's kind of a pattern to it. There's a way in which it branches, right? So there's the trunk, and then the branches, and that same kind of pattern is present when you consider the same object at a different scale. When you, right, figuratively, when you zoom in, right, and you see the same kind of pattern, the same type of organization being present at different scales. So trees tend to have this kind of fractal structuring, and again, that can be a matter of degree, right? There's a range within which you observe something at different scales that's also found at other scales. And interestingly, behavior is fractal too. And so when you examine, when you use nonlinear methods of analysis of behavioral data, you find fractal scaling. That is, you find patterns of organization that are present in some measurement of the behavior of a living system. In this case, data collected from human participants in an experiment. And there's some kind of scaling. There's some kind of pattern that's preserved over transformation of scale. So when you zoom in on the data, you see some of the same patterns happening again and again as you zoom in further, kind of like the snowflake type of pattern you see on the left side there. So here's the thing. Matrona and Varela don't talk about fractality and these related concepts explicitly. So this is something that I'm proposing can be useful for understanding what they're saying, right? So fractality is a feature of complex systems. And activism is an approach to cognition that adopts a complex systems perspective that's trying to understand cognition and cognitive systems as complex systems. And so it does make sense to wonder and to think about um, the potential fractal nature of cognitive systems, given that they, as living systems, they are complex systems. And what they are saying is that living systems are self-individuating, right? That's what we just saw. They maintain themselves. That is, a living system through its operation, through its functioning, it sustains the conditions that are required for the system's own viability, right? The system is maintaining itself by maintaining the circular organization that it has and its relations to the environment. And this organization, as we saw, is what generates the identity of the system, right? This organization um, is what maintains the um, the differentiation between the system and what is not the system, right? The things that the system interacts with that are not itself. And so this identifies the system. This reveals what the system is, and really what they're claiming is that it constitutes the identity of the system, right? Through its working, through its functioning, through interacting with things that are not the system itself, um, it maintains the conditions for the system's viability, and it preserves this kind of distinction between itself and the things it interacts with. And so that means we can say that the system preserves its identity over change, right? There are changes going on within the system through its interactions with the environment, and it's maintaining its own identity over a range of transformations. And there's a range of transformations that are acceptable, right? There's a range of ways in which you changed from when you were born until who you are now, right? There's a range of changes that happen to you through your interactions with the environment. And you maintain your identity. You continue being yourself, right? There, there are ways in which maybe your personality changed. There are ways in which your body changed, but through all of these changes, you're still you, right? There are ways in which we ordinarily, like in day-to-day language, would say, oh, that person, he's not himself anymore, right? But strictly speaking, that's still the same person, right? And the point is, through all of these interactions and changes and transformations, you maintain, right? This specific living system maintains its own identity, and it's when something more dramatic, when there's a more dramatic disruption of the workings of the system, that we can say that that was a kind of transformation that that compromised the identity of the system, right? So all of this to say that what they are providing us is a way of thinking about the identity of systems, their self-individuation, and so on, in which there's a range of transformations, right? Um, through which the system is still itself. It's maintaining itself. It's maintaining its identity, and that is um, something that's one of the components of a fractal system. So that's one reason why it can be helpful to think of fractality and fractal systems, right? Because that living systems in their description do fit the perspective, at least to this extent. But there's an additional reason that I think fractals are helpful here, and that's because the pattern of explanation that Matrona and Varela provide is fractal. So now we're not talking about the system being a fractal system, but the type of explanation that they are given of living systems follows a fractal pattern, because they are talking about, in some sense, biological organization that's nested within a larger system of biological organization that's also nested within a larger system of biological organization. So they say a particular self-referent system may have the circular organization of a living system, or partake functionally of the circular organization of its components, or both. And here's the example that they give. The society of bees, the honey-producing bees, is an example of a third order self-referring system of this kind. It has a circular organization superimposed on the second order self-referring systems that are the bees, which in turn have a circular organization superimposed on the first order living systems that are the cells. All three systems, with their domains of interactions, are subordinated both to the maintenance of themselves and to the maintenance of the others. Right? So these are nested systems, and they are providing us then a perspective that explains the workings of these systems that's free of scale. Right? They're saying we understand the living system in terms of its interactions and how when it's functioning well, the system maintains the conditions for its existence, and it maintains this kind of circular organization. And this, what they're saying, applies to the cell. It applies to understanding the bee, right? And all the cells that make up the bee. And it applies to understanding the society of bees, which is made up of bees, individual bees that are made up of cells, right? There's this kind of nested hierarchy of organization, of self-referring systems. So extrapolating from what they're proposing here, perhaps we could say that the same applies to the bee ecosystem and maybe to the whole planet Earth, right? To all of living systems. Perhaps then there's some degree of application of this scaling of the same pattern of explanation in terms of circular organization that applies, from the cell to all of life. So to understand what they're referring to as the self-referential nature of living systems, it's helpful again to remind ourselves that there's a distinction between the observer and the system itself at play here, right? And so they're saying that when we describe living systems, it can be tempting to talk about, and I'm quoting here, it can be tempting to talk about the nervous system as one would talk about a stable system with input. And Maturana says, this I reject, because it misses entirely the point by introducing the distortion of our participation as observers into the explanation of systems whose organization must be understood as entirely self-referring. We're imposing from our perspective as observers something that we think is part of the system, but that's alien to the workings of the system as a closed system. So Maturana says, what occurs in a living system is analogous to what occurs in an instrumental flight, where the pilot does not have access to the outside world and must function only as a controller of the values shown in his flight instruments. His task is to secure a path of variations in the readings of his instruments, either according to a prescribed plan or to one that becomes specified by these readings. When the pilot steps out of the plane, he's bewildered by the congratulations of his friends on account of the perfect flight and landing that he performed in absolute darkness. He's perplexed because, to his knowledge, all that he did at any moment was to maintain the readings of his instruments within certain specified limits, a task which is in no way represented by the description that his friends, they are external observers, make of his conduct. In terms of their function organization, living systems do not have inputs and outputs, although under perturbations they maintain constant their set states, and it's only in our descriptions, when we include them as parts of larger systems which we define, that we can say that they do. It's only in our descriptions, when we describe systems as part of larger systems, that we can say that there's input and output, right? Because then we're talking about interactions of parts within the system. But when we adopt this descriptive approach in our analysis of the living organization, we cannot but subordinate our understanding of it to notions valid only for men-made, that are allo-referring systems, where indeed input and output functions are all important through the purposeful design of their role in the larger systems in which they're included. And this is misleading. In the organization of the living systems, the role of the effector surfaces is only to maintain constant the set states of the receptor surfaces, not to act upon an environment, no matter how adequate such a description may seem to be for the analysis of adaptation or other processes. A grasp of this is fundamental for the understanding of the organization of living systems. And again, he's saying here that this is fundamental for understanding the organization of living systems as living systems from the perspective of living systems, right? So to understand how they work in terms that are appropriate to the living system itself, not um, that are imposed by our descriptive lens from the outside. So continuing, an observer beholding an autopoietic system as a unity in a context that he also observes and which he describes as its environment may distinguish in it internally and externally generated perturbations, even though these are intrinsically indistinguishable for the autopoietic system itself. The observer can use these distinctions to make statements about the history of the autopoietic system which he observes, and he can use this history to describe an ambience which he infers as the domain in which the system exists. He cannot, however, infer from the observed correspondence between the ontogeny of the system, that is the origin of the system, and the ambience which this ontogeny describes, or from the environment in which he sees it, a constituted representation of these in the organization of the autopoietic systems. The continuous correspondence between conduct and ambience revealed during ontogeny is the result of the homeostatic nature of the autopoietic organization, and not the existence of any representation of the ambience in it. Nor is it at all necessary that the autopoietic system should obtain or develop such a representation to persist in a changing ambience. To talk about a representation of the ambience or the environment in the organization of a living system may be metaphorically useful, but it is inadequate and misleading to reveal the organization of an autopoietic system. Again, it can be useful from the outside, right? It can be a useful descriptive lens, but it will be one that's imposed from the outside. It's not one that concerns the actual organization of the living system as a living system in itself. So these are some of the ideas that Matrona and Varela proposed in their book Autopoiesis and Cognition that then serve as the foundation for work in the inactive approach in cognitive science, right? And again, they are coming from a perspective of theoretical biology, and they're trying to say, how can we understand cognition from this lens, from the lens of understanding of living things, living systems, as biological systems, as complex systems, right? Systems that are self-organized in some sense. So this is kind of the vision that they are articulating. But all of that we've seen so far is really providing us that starting point, which is the first step, which is the distinction between the system and the observer, right? So in light of this, then we can turn to the more specific concepts that we've been kind of dancing around, right? You've been hearing ideas related to these concepts, but with a focus on the distinction between the system and the observer. And so we can now try to make more sense of these ideas that come out of a distinction between the system and the observer. So a central idea in the inactive approach is the idea that living systems are autopoietic systems. And in the introduction, back to the 1980 book introduction, Matrona says that when he wrote Biology of Cognition in 1970, he says he did not yet have the word autopoiesis. But he says that the basic relations embodied in the notion of autopoiesis are fully implied although cumbersomely said, by expressions such as circular organization and self-referential systems. So, what we have been saying so far are, he recognizes, kind of convoluted ways of getting at the concept of autopoiesis and autopoietic systems. So what is autopoiesis? The autopoiesis is a made-up word. It's a term that they come up with to articulate this notion of self-causation or self-production. That's literally what the word means, right? Autopoiesis, self-causation or self-production. So to understand what it means to say that living systems are autopoietic systems, that is, they're self-causing or self-producing systems, let's think for a second about non-living systems, right? So machines that we create that are not alive, right? Like here I have an example of a train, but any machine you can think of, right? There are similarities between these non-living systems and living systems, organisms, animals, cells, and so on, right? Machines stand in relations. They interact with the environment, right, with their surroundings. You can describe a range of interactions that they hold. So ways in which they change based on what's happening in their surroundings. And there is something like you could describe the machine as functioning well or not, right? There's some sense in which you can say that this machine is operating properly, or you could say that it's not operating properly. And that's something that machines have in common with living organisms. You could say this living organism is doing well, is operating properly, it's functioning well, right? Or not. These are ways in which machines, right, mechanical, non-living systems are similar to living systems, but non-living systems are radically unlike living systems in the following way. There's this sense in which they're described by hard assembly, right? They involve the assembly of parts with specific functions and that are rigidly assigned a role in the system, right? There's very little possibility of flexible adaptation. Machines typically don't adapt, right? And the parts of the machines play a pre-specified role, right? The machines are designed such that the parts play a specific role, and that won't change. The specific parts won't come to play a different role over time, or the same role that's played by something won't be played by something else, right? That's the notion of hard assembly, as opposed to soft assembly, which is what living systems exhibit, right? There's plasticity, for example, in the brain. There's some kind of sense of flexibility in the organization of living systems, where one part of the system can compensate for changes in the other part so as to maintain proper function. That's a radical difference between non-living systems and living systems. Another one that's crucial is that the structure of a machine, the structure of non-living system, doesn't serve its own ends, right? The machine is put together, it's built, right? It's designed and constructed to achieve goals that we have as designers, engineers, or users, right? The machine is there to accomplish something that's independent of its own goals. And in fact, that's a crucial difference, is that machines, it doesn't even make sense to say the machines have their own goals, right? What's the purpose of a machine, right? That purpose is not self-referential. It's not about the machine, but it's about the users of the machine, right? So there's no such thing as the machine's own ends. But we can say that living systems have their own ends, right? And so when we say that a machine is functioning well, or a living system is functioning well, right? When we say that a machine is functioning properly, and it's operating properly, or a living organism is operating properly, that is in reference to different things, right? When an organism is functioning properly, that's in its own terms. You're saying it is working properly, it's operating in a functional manner given its own ends, given its own conditions of life. Whereas the machine, when it functions properly, it's not because it's healthy, right? It's because it's useful. The machine that works properly is not serving its own ends, but it's serving our ends. A biological system that functions properly is serving its own ends. It's surviving and it's thriving and so on, right? From its own perspective. So these differences then can help us make sense of how living systems are different from non-living systems and are autopoietic systems. So autopoiesis again is literally self-causation or self-production, and components of of this concept of self-causation or self-production are the concepts of autonomy, operational closure, and structural coupling. Autopoietic systems exhibit all of these characteristics. They are autonomous, they are operationally closed, and they are structurally coupled to the environment. So the notion of autonomy, literally, auto nomos it means self-ruling, right? Nomos suggests rules, laws, right? So um, something is autonomous when it rules itself, as opposed to being ruled by something external to itself, right? Being ruled by someone else. An autonomous community is a community that sets its own rules. It's not ruled by a larger community. Countries are autonomous when they rule themselves, as opposed to being ruled by other countries or by other organizations. An individual is autonomous when it rules its own behavior, as opposed to being mandated by um, someone, right? So that the relation of slave to owner, right? The slave is um, is the autonomy of the slave is taken away from it, so it's not allowed to be self-ruling. Now, so this is an important aspect of living systems. They are autonomous. So this is quoting by from Di Paolo, Rode, and De Jager. They say, living organisms are autonomous. They follow laws set up by their own activity. Fundamentally, they can be autonomous only by virtue of their self-generated identity as distinct entities. A system whose identity is fully specified by a designer and cannot, by means of its own actions, regenerate its own constitution, can only follow the laws contained in its design, no matter how plastic, adaptive, or lifelike its performance, right? So a machine can't regenerate itself. It can't maintain itself. Its functioning will be dictated by the plan, by the laws contained in the design. They continue, in order for a system to generate its own laws, it must be able to build itself at some level of the identity. If a system has no say in defining its own organization, then it is condemned to follow an externally given design, like a railroad track, right? Like the train is following the track, right? There's no possibility of deviating from the track that's preset, predetermined, right? A system that's autonomous has some ability to change, right? And if something happens, some drastic perturbation, the system is able to regenerate itself. It's able to fix itself, which is something that a non-living system can't, right? That is, a non-autonomous system can't. So that's the first concept of autonomy. The notion of operational closure, it concerns the quality of a system when its parts are related in the following way, right? So a system is operationally closed when, for any given process, P, that is part of the system, some other processes in the system provide the enabling conditions for P, right? So P depend on the conditions provided by at least some other processes in the system. And at the same time, some other processes in the system depend on P. Not all, right? Not directly, at least. But a system is operationally closed when all of these processes are related in this way, right? all of the processes that make up the system are dependent on other processes that make up the system. And these other processes are dependent on some other process, right? So operationally, the system is closed when the processes are interrelated in this way. And Maturana, Varela, and others collaborating with Varela later give the example of this kind of artificial system, a one-dimensional cellular automaton they call Vittorio, that works in this way, right? So there's these cells and they interact with each other, and each cell depends on conditions um, provided by other cells and for specific processes. And processes that these other cells engage in are dependent on conditions provided by the other cells, some of the other cells. And if you traced the, what one cell depends on, if you traced all of the relations of dependence there, they will all end up being within the system, right? So this cell depends on this one other cell and that other one, and this other one depends on this one and the other one, and so they are all interconnected in some way. When you trace all of the relations, they are dependent on the processes and the conditions provided by all of the other components and only components within the system. So if you go back to that, the fictional example I gave earlier of a system that's interacting with some things in its environment, right? So maybe to make it a little more specific there, each of the components of the system, each of the green dots, they bear some relation to other green dots that are part of the system, and so each green dot is providing conditions for some other green dot, and it depends on conditions provided by other green dots, um, and it's operationally closed when all of these processes are interrelated in the way that I just described, right? Now, this system that you're looking at is operationally closed, but it is also structurally coupled to its environment. So the idea here is that two systems, or a system and its environment, they are said to be structurally coupled when they have a history of recurrent interactions. And these recurrent interactions lead over time to some kind of congruence in the systems or between the system and its environment, right? There's some way in which over time, through interaction, the activity of one changes the other. So we could say that activity of system A impacts the activity of system B if they're two systems that are coupled to each other, or the activity of system A and the activity in the environment B. So A impacts B, and then B impacts A back. And then this impacted A impacts B, and so on, right? So when over time there's this kind of iterative influence, then we can say that there is structural coupling between the two systems, or between the system and its environment. So bringing these ideas together, right? Operational closure and structural coupling. They say here, as a closed neuronal network, the nervous system has no input or output. And there's no intrinsic feature in its organization which would allow it to discriminate through the dynamics of its changes of state between possible internal or external causes for these changes of state. Right? As a closed neuronal network, the nervous system has no input or output. So the first point that follows from this then is, they say here, that the phenomenology of the changes of state of the nervous system is exclusively the phenomenology of the changes of state of a closed neuronal network. That is, for the nervous system as a neuronal network, there is no inside or outside. There's just the system. There's just the operations of the system. The second point, the distinction between internal and external causes in the origin of the changes of state of the nervous system can only be made by an observer that beholds the organism, the nervous system, as a unity, and defines its inside and outside by specifying its boundaries, right? For the system itself, for the nervous system itself, all there is relations between the parts, where um, each component of the system may be subjected to perturbations, but that won't be understood as an input or output. From the perspective of the system itself, there is no input or output. All there is changes in state in an operationally closed network. Now, this network is structurally coupled to the environment, which means that over time there is a convergence between its environment and the system. But only from the outside as observers that we can look at the organism and describe its unity and distinguish it from its environment. And so we can then identify, there's an inside of the system and there's an outside. And we can say, oh, what's happening here is input, and then the system provides this output. This is at the descriptive level from the outside. If you are trying to understand the actual working of the system itself, right, there's a level of description where all that is going on is these changes of state within the system, right? It's these components of the system interacting with other components of the system and adapting and changing as an outcome of their interactions. So continuing, it follows that it is only with respect to the domain of interactions of the organism as a unity that the changes of state of the nervous system may have an internal or an external origin, and hence that the history of the causes of the changes of state of the nervous system lies in a different phenomenological domain than the changes of the states themselves. Right? The history of the causes of changes in state in the nervous system. This history of changes, it belongs to the domain of the observer describing the system. For the system itself, all there is reorganization over time of itself, right? It's adapting and it's changing states over time. But when it comes to the organization of the nervous system itself, it doesn't make sense to think in terms of inside and outside. For the system, there isn't outside or inside. All there is the unfolding of its dynamics. To continue, the operation of the nervous system as a component of the organism is a continuous generation of significant neuronal relations, and all the transformations that it may undergo as a closed neural network are subordinated to this. If, as a result of a perturbation, the nervous system fails in the generation of the significant neuronal relations for its participation in the autopoiesis of the organism disintegrates. Right? So if you're focusing on the nervous system as a living system, right, then from the outside, as observers, we can identify the nesting of the nervous system as a living system inside the organism as a living system. Right? The organization of the nervous system itself, right, is of a certain kind. It's, there's an operational closure there. But because it is structurally coupled to this larger system, which is the organism as a whole, then it is dependent on the organism, and the organism is dependent on the nervous system, such that if this organization fails, the organism disintegrates, and therefore the nervous system also disintegrates. So the idea here is that when a precarious network of dynamical processes is operationally closed, an identity emerges. So we're saying the living systems are autopoietic. This includes then the idea that living systems are operationally closed, but they are structurally coupled to their environment. And the emergence of the system's identity then is due to the fact that the operation of the system, the organization of the system is self-producing, self-maintaining, self-ruling, right? There's the sense of autonomy there. So there is such a thing as good functioning. We can speak of the system functioning well or operating properly. But this is self-referential, right? It's not in terms of something outside of the system. The system is operating well, and that means that it is maintaining its viability. It's maintaining itself alive, and it's maintaining the conditions that allow it to survive and to function well. That's what functioning well means. So it's in its own terms. Um, and so a living system as an autopoietic system, as a self-causing, right, system, it generates its own identity. It individuates itself. It distinguishes itself from its environment through its operational closure, even while interacting with the environment, and it maintains its own viability. It sustains the conditions that it depends on for functioning well. Though, of course, living systems don't maintain their conditions of life indefinitely. And that's why I'm saying here that these dynamical processes are precarious, right? There's some sense in which they are precarious, in that there's only a limited range of transformations that preserve the identity of the system, right? There are only a range of perturbations that will allow the system to continue existing, right? It won't lead to its destruction or disintegration. So living systems are autopoietic then, in that they have this kind of circular organization. They cause themselves, right? They maintain themselves. They maintain themselves by distinguishing themselves from things that aren't them, the things they interact with. But they are coupled to these things that they interact with, and that's part of maintaining their good functioning, which is understood in their own terms, in autonomous terms, unlike machines, right, which are not autopoietic. They don't have the kind of flexibility and autonomy that we see in living systems. The primary example for an activist is the cell, the living cell. That's the most basic autopoietic system in nature. And from a basic knowledge from biology courses, you can see why, right? So the cell produces a semi-permeable membrane. This membrane, it's important that it's only semi-permeable, right? It's not fully permeable. There's a limit. So the membrane allows some things to come into the cell and come out, right? So the membrane allows some changes in the cell. And so the good functioning of the cell produces a barrier, a boundary, right? That's the membrane. This membrane is a boundary for the cell's metabolic processes. So this means that it separates the cell from what's outside of it, and it delineates what the cell is, right? It enables the preservation of the cell's identity over interactions, right? So it is interacting, it's changing, but the membrane sets a boundary that maintains or preserves the identity of the cell over time, over interactions. So this is the kind of primary example of an autopoietic system, because it's the most basic autopoietic system that we find in nature. But again, if you recall how I was saying that they are giving us a kind of a fractal pattern of explanation, they're saying that this understanding of how the cell works, right, also applies, for example, to how a bee works, and that will also apply to how the society of bees works, right? So it's independent of the scale that we focus on, the same pattern of explanation that's looking at these processes of self-organization, self-individuation, right, autonomy, and so on, They are present in living systems, no matter the scale you focus on, no matter the scale that we as observers adopt to describe the system as a living system. And it's with this in mind then that we get to the notions of sense making and bringing forth a world. Another, so inactivists will often describe the workings of bacteria. And I have these images here to describe the situation, to illustrate the situation that Evan Thompson describes in his book. He says, consider motile bacteria swimming uphill in a food gradient of sugar. There's a gradient of sugar there, right? The cells tumble about until they hit on an orientation that increases their exposure to sugar, at which point they swim forward, up gradient, toward the zone of greatest sugar concentration. This is different from the bacteria that's in an environment where there's no gradient of food, right? That's just moving randomly. So Thompson says, this behavior happens because the bacteria are able to sense chemically the concentration of sugar in their local environment through molecular receptors in the membranes. They're able to move forward by rotating their flagella in coordination like a propeller. These bacteria are, of course, autopoietic. They also embody a dynamic sensor-motor loop. The way they move, tumbling or swimming forward, depends on what they sense. And what they sense depends on how they move. Moreover, the sensor-motor loop both expresses and is subordinated to the system's autonomy, to the maintenance of the system's autopoiesis. As a result, every sensor-motor interaction and every discriminable feature of the environment embodies or reflects the bacterial perspective. For instance, although sucrose is a real and present condition of the physical chemical environment, its status as food is not, right? The fact that sugar is food is not a fact of the environment. That sucrose is a nutrient isn't intrinsic to the structure of the sucrose molecule. It's a relational feature linked to the bacterium's metabolism. It's for the bacterium that sugar has nutritional value, right? It doesn't have that value in and of itself. So sucrose has significance or value as food, but only in the milieu that the organism itself brings into existence. So it's the organism's functioning in that environment and that confers significance to the conditions it's finding in this environment, right? So it's in this sense that the organism, through its functioning, is bringing forth a world. There's, there's the space there. There are the chemical elements that are there. There are these physical chemical properties that are there. But through acting in the environment, the bacterium makes it possible for itself to perceive, right? And its perception makes it possible to move in the environment. And this relation that it bears to the environment is what makes the, otherwise not meaningful features of the environment meaningful, because they are meaningful for the organism that can perceive and move in those specified ways, right? It's the type of thing that the bacterium is that makes sugar relevant for it. Right? So it's in this sense that through functioning in the world, through operating in the environment and through performing the organism's own living organization, that it brings forth a world, right? It gives rise to a world of significance. But again, this is a relational matter, right? It's significant. That environment is significant to the organism, and so It's through the organism's activity in the environment that it gives rise to a world that is significant to itself. So Thompson describes this diagram that is actually inspired by a diagram provided by Varela. But working through this briefly I think will help bring some of these ideas together, right? So in this diagram, you can see that identity entails a domain of interactions. Domain of interactions is responsible for the emergence of signification or valence, right? Values. So it's the domain of interactions that determines the things that are significant or valuable for the organism. Now, the things that are significant and valuable for the organism have an informational link to the operational closure of the system, which in turn gives rise to the identity, right, of the system. So the fact that the system is operationally closed gives rise to the system's identity. It determines what the system is and what is not the system, what is outside of it, right? What's different from it. This identity entails that there's a domain of interactions. There's a domain of relations to other things, which give rise to the significance or the value of these other things that the system interacts with. But that's linked to the operational closure, the closed operations of the system within itself. So explaining this diagram, Thompson says the first point is that life equals autopoiesis. Life is autopoiesis. Life is self-causation, right? Living systems are self-causing systems, self-organizing systems. So he says, by this I mean the thesis that the three criteria of autopoiesis, a boundary containing a molecular reaction network that produces and regenerates itself, and the boundary, are necessary and sufficient for the organization of minimal life. Minimally, that's what life is. Life is autopoiesis. The second point is that autopoiesis entails emergence of a self. Autopoiesis entails emergence of a self, right? It gives rise to identity. So he says a physical autopoietic system, by virtue of its operational closure, gives rise to an individual or a self in the form of a living body, an organism. Right? That's the point that we've seen. So encapsulating that idea that the operational closure, from the operational closure emerges a system with an identity. The third point is that the emergence of a self entails the emergence of a world. The emergence of a self is also by necessity the emergence of a correlative domain of interactions proper to that self. An Umwelt is the term that he uses, and that's a term that we'll talk about more in the future in this course. Right? The idea is that it's not that the emergence of a self entails the emergence of a physical environment. The physical environment exists, right? But it's not a physical environment on its own is not meaningful. The Umwelt is the meaningful environment. It's the environment that has significance for the organism. And that is something that emerges from a self, which emerges from the operational closure, right? And entails a domain of interactions from which the significance emerges. And the fourth point, emergence of a self and a world equals to sense making. That's what sense making is. So in this perspective, the organism's world is the sense it makes of the environment. Right? When the organism brings forth a world, this world that it brings forth is the sense that it makes of the environment. This world is a place of significance and valence as a result of the global action of the organism. Right? So as a self or the system's identity emerges and a world emerges, right? The system bringing forth a world is what an activist will call sense making, right? Because this world, this environment is an environment of significance, and this means that it's significant for the organism, right? That's a relational characteristic. And that's what sense making is. It's the sense that the organism makes um, of the environment. It's the emergence of this relation of signification. And the fifth point then is that sense making equals to cognition. Sense making, what we just described, is cognition. That's what cognition is. Sense making is tantamount to cognition in the minimal sense of viable sensory-motor conduct. Such conduct is oriented toward and subject to signification and valence. Signification and valence do not pre-exist out there, but are enacted or constituted by the living being. Living entails sense making, which equals cognition. Being alive means to bring forth a world of signification, a world of significance. Being alive means making sense of your experience and relations to the world, right? It means making sense of what the world is presenting. And that's what cognition is. But again, it's important, because when we say sense making, it may sound this high cognitive thing. It's like thinking, reasoning about. Think back to the cell, right? As the primary example of an autopoietic system. The cell is a living system, right? And it's making sense. It engages in sense making. It engages in bringing forth a world and making sense of the world, right? And that's what cognition is. And so when we talk about the behavior of humans and we're describing, human cognitive systems, what we are saying in this perspective is that that as living systems, we make sense of the world. But it's in this basic biological sense that applies also to what cells do. So there's a later book, The Tree of Knowledge, that Maturana and Varela published in 1987. And they say here, since all cognition brings forth a world, our starting point will necessarily be the operational effectiveness of living beings in their domain of existence. And so in this perspective, then, they characterize cognition as an effective action, an action that will enable a living being to continue its existence in a definite environment as it brings forth its world. Nothing more, nothing less. And there's a page in the book, The Tree of Knowledge, where they get into the specific point of the comparison between the brain and the computer. I'll post this page so you can read this blurb. But part of what they're saying here is that when we describe a nervous system as an input-output system that processes information, manipulates representations, what we're doing is we're describing the system, this biological living system, as if it was a machine built by humans. But it's not a machine built by humans. It's a biological living system, right? So we're not, when we describe a nervous system as a computational input-output system, we're describing it as if it were something that it is not, right? A machine. They're saying that what is necessary, therefore, is to recognize the nervous system as a unity, defined by its internal relations in which interactions come into play only by modulating its structural dynamics, that is, as a unity with operational closure. The nervous system brings forth a world by specifying what patterns of the environment are perturbations and what changes trigger them in the organism. The popular metaphor of calling the brain an information processing device, they say, is not only ambiguous, but patently wrong. But it's only later in this book published in 1991, titled The Embodied Mind, that the term inaction comes to be used. And so what we've been seeing is kind of the background, the foundation, the conceptual foundation for the inactive approach, properly speaking, right? All of the elements are there. What's missing is the term inaction, right? the understanding of cognition as an action. And this is something that comes up in the Varela, Thompson, and Walsh book from 1991, The Embodied Mind, Cognitive Science, and Human Experience. So they say, let us explain what we mean by this phrase, embodied action. By using the term embodied, we mean to highlight 2 points. First, that cognition depends upon the kinds of experience that come from having a body with various sensory-motor capacities. And second, that these individual sensory-motor capacities are themselves embedded in a more encompassing biological, psychological, and cultural context. By using the term action, we mean to emphasize once again that sensory and motor processes, perception and action, are fundamentally inseparable in lived cognition. Indeed, the two are not merely contingently linked individuals. They have also evolved together. And they do rely, they make reference to work of the kind that we mentioned previously by Rodney Brooks and other roboticists, right, that are doing this kind of biologically inspired or evolutionary approach in robotics. Right, so there's this close link between perception and action, and actually the recognition that they are never separate in lived cognition. And so it's in this context then that they propose the notion of inaction as a way of understanding cognition. And they say we can now give a preliminary formulation of what we mean by inaction. In a nutshell, the inactive approach consists of 2 points. First, the perception consists in perceptually guided action, right? Perception isn't independent from action. What we mean by perception is really perceptually guided action. It's always active in this sense. And 2, cognitive structures emerge from the recurrent sensory-motor patterns that enable action to be perceptually guided, right? So there's, through this recurrent, repeated nature, through sensory-motor coupling, which enables action to be perceptually guided, right? Enables action to be guided by perception, and so cognitive structures emerge from this, emerge through this history of what we've described as a sensory-motor coupling of the system. So they continue here, as we can now appreciate, to situate cognition as embodied action within the context of evolution as natural drift provides a view of cognitive capacities as inextricably linked to histories that are lived, much like paths that exist only as they're laid down in walking, right? Paths that emerge as you walk and as you walk again on the same path, right? And through the process of walking, you lay down the path, they're saying. Consequently, cognition is no longer seen as problem solving on the basis of representations. Instead, cognition in its most encompassing sense consists in the enactment or bringing forth of a world by a viable history of structural coupling. And I highlighted the word viable here to remind you then of what we saw earlier, right? So there's a sense in which the living system is precarious, right? There's a limited range of transformations and changes that it can undergo and maintain its identity. It can continue being what it is. It can continue functioning well, right? But because of the circular organization of living systems, it's interesting that within that range of transformations and changes, what it does is actually maintain the conditions that it depends on to live, right? And that's what they're saying cognition is. Cognition, again, in its most encompassing sense, consists in this enactment or bringing forth of a world by a viable history of structural coupling. A history of structural coupling that is viable for the system and that maintains its own viability. And this perspective that they propose then is, they say it's proscriptive, rather than prescriptive. They say any action undertaken by the system is permitted as long as it does not violate the constraint of having to maintain the integrity of the system and or its lineage. Yet another way to express this idea would be to say that cognition as embodied action is always about or directed towards something that is missing. What is this thing that's missing? On the one hand, there's always a next step for the system in its perceptually guided action. On the other hand, the actions of the system are always directed towards situations that have yet to become actual. Thus, cognition as embodied action both poses the problems and specifies those paths that must be tread or laid down for their solution. So you see, in this biological perspective then, more than simply saying that cognition is problem solving on the basis of representations, it's solving problems for a living being, right? For a living system. And so that means that it's pre-specified in the organization of the living systems, the paths for solving those problems, right? Because again, instead of thinking of problems as from a conceptual or abstract perspective, we understand problem as the basic problem of maintaining the system's functions, right? Of preserving the system's identity and maintaining its own viability, right? So there's in this deeper biological sense, right? There's a historical unfolding of the system's behavior, and cognition is this: it's maintaining, it's managing the system's unfolding over a range of transformations that is acceptable, that doesn't violate the constraints of the system, and making sure that the system doesn't step outside of this range of transformations and changes that are viable, that maintain the system's viability. So this idea that from the perspective of an activism, we bring forth a world, that's what cognition is, that's what sense making is. We bring forth a world, right? A world emerges through our activity. This idea has been criticized by many people as being a form of idealism. If you recall the beginning of the lecture, right? It is a rejection of realism. It's a rejection of the idea that there is a world independent of us and independent of our activities that we internally represent right inside the system. It's rejecting that idea. But some people say, yeah, and it's an idealist rejection of realism. But for an activist, it's not. It's not idealism. It's yet another possibility. This bringing forth of a world is not saying that only this world that we create exists, and we right, only this domain of ideas and thoughts that we have. So this is Tony Chimero, 2009, Radical Embodied Cognitive Science is the title of the book. He's quoting Varela, Thompson, and Roche. So the quote is this. Varela, Thompson, and Roche are saying, "It is precisely this emphasis on mutual specification that enables us to negotiate a middle path between the silo of cognition as the recovery of pre-given outer world, which is realism, and the Charybdis of cognition as the projection of a pre-given inner world, that's idealism. These two extremes both take representation as their central notion. In the first case, representation is used to recover what is outer, what is outside. In the second, it is used to project what is inner, and it's the representations that are projected and constitute a world. And they say, our intention is to bypass entirely this logical geography of inner versus outer. By studying cognition not as a projection of a world or a recovery of an external world, but as embodied action. And so commenting on this quote, Chimero says, by rejecting representationalism, which is to say, by being radical embodied cognitive scientists, Varela and colleagues claim to stake out a position that is neither realist nor idealist. Under our view, animals and worlds are not separate, so there's no need for animals to represent the world. Without representations, there's nothing besides the world for the animal, to interact with. But the worlds that animals, including humans, including philosophers and physicists, interact with are strictly limited and are determined by the sensory-motor capabilities that the animal has. Right? So that's a way that they navigate a path that's not an extreme version of realism or idealism, um, but it's something in between because it rejects the representational basis for either the realist view that we recover internally what exists out there, or the idealist view that we merely project from our representation, we project a world. They're saying through embodied action, um, we give rise to a world, right? A world of significance that is specific to the sort of thing that we are, the sort of organism that we are. So to conclude, um, in a passage in the 1991 The Embodied Mind book, Varela, Thompson, and Rush give I think a nice illustration or description of 3 different approaches to cognition that will be useful for us by examining 3 questions. Right? The questions are, what is cognition? How does it work? And how do I know when a cognitive system is functioning adequately? 3 questions that we can use to examine different approaches to cognition. The first approach to cognition is cognitivism, is computationalism, representationalism. So question 1, what is cognition? From the computationalist perspective, from a cognitivist perspective, the answer is that cognition is information processing as symbolic computation. That is rule-based manipulation of symbols. Question 2, how does cognition work? The answer is through any device that can support and manipulate discrete functional elements, the symbols. The system interacts only with the form of the symbols, right? It's a formal symbol system, so that's their physical attributes, not their meaning. And then question 3, how do I know when a cognitive system is functioning adequately? And the answer, if you're a cognitivist, is this. The system is functioning adequately when the symbols appropriately represent some aspect of the real world. And the information processing leads to a successful solution of the problem given to the system. That's the cognitivist perspective. The other approach that they talk about is connectionism. And again, because this is 1991, so they are coming from the context in which the connectionist challenge was very salient in cognitive science. So if you adopt the perspective of connectionism, what is cognition? The answer there is that it's the emergence of global states in a network of simple components. So this should ring a bell for you, right? From when we consider the connectionist approach. How does it work? How does cognition work if you're describing it from a connectionist perspective? The answer, through local rules for individual operation and rules for changes in the connectivity among the elements, right? And then question 3, how do I know when a cognitive system is functioning adequately, right? If this cognitive system is a connectionist network. The answer is when the emergent properties and resulting structure can be seen to correspond to a specific cognitive capacity, a successful solution to a required task. Lastly, then, we get to the enactive approach, right? Understanding cognition not from the cognitivist perspective or the connectionist perspective, but from the enactivist perspective. So what is cognition? The answer here is that cognition is an action. It's a history of structural coupling that brings forth a world. How does cognition work? The answer, it works through a network of consisting of multiple levels of interconnected sensory-motor subnetworks. And how do I know when a cognitive system is functioning adequately? The answer is when it becomes part of an ongoing existing world, as the young of every species do, or when it shapes a new one, as happens in evolutionary history. Right? So you see the same pattern of explanation applies to an individual
was born into a world, right, and it joins a, a world. It becomes part of this existing world. But also, the same explanation or explanatory approach applies to species over evolutionary history, right? And again, this um, I think gives support to my suggestion that we think of the pattern of explanation here as being fractal in nature, right? The scale that we're considering can vary, but the style of explanation remains the same. When we talk about the living cell, about the organism that the cell is a part of, or a community that the organism belongs to, um, and here, when you talk about the organism as it comes into existence and joins a world, or when a world comes into existence, when the species shapes a new world for its members. So concluding then this is from the paper by DiPaolo and Thompson, and this is from the end of the conclusion of the paper, where they explain this idea, right? The idea that the body is crucial for cognition. This is something that many embodied cognitive scientists would agree with. Yeah, the body is crucial for cognition, and that's the basic claim of embodied cognition, of embodied cognitive science. But how do you explain, how do you make sense of this sentence if you're advocating a particular version of embodied cognitive science that's inactive, right? It's adopting the inactive approach. So DiPaolo and Thompson here say, so they break this sentence down, this idea down into three components. First, we need to understand what is meant by the body. Then we need to understand what is meant by cognition. And then what is meant by crucial. When we say that the body is crucial for cognition, we need to understand what we mean by the body, what we mean by cognition, and what we mean by crucial. So the first point, enactivism, unlike other approaches, attempts to provide a principled definition of the body as a self-individuating system. The concept of autonomy is what allows us to provide this definition. Thus, what is meant by body for the enactive approach is not the body as a functional system defined in terms of inputs and outputs, as it is for functionalist cognitive science, even functionalist embodied cognition, right? Extended mind and so on. So it's not it's not the body as a functional system defined in terms of inputs and outputs, but rather the body as an adaptively autonomous and therefore sense-making system. In this biological sense of sense-making. That's what the body is. Second, cognition in its most general form is sense-making. It's the adaptive regulation of states and interactions by an agent with respect to consequences for the agent's own viability. And then third, what does it mean to say that the body then is crucial for cognition? The idea here is that without a body, there cannot be sense-making. Moreover, sense-making is a bodily process of adaptive self-regulation. The link between the body and cognition is accordingly constitutive and not merely causal. To be a sense-maker is, among other things, to be autonomous and precarious, that is, to be a body in the precise sense of body that the enactive approach indicates. So this gives a good summary of what we've been discussing so far, right? Of this basic picture of the enactive approach to cognition, right? That's what it means from an enactive perspective to say that the body is crucial for cognition. And again, all of this is inspired by and initially articulated by the work by Maturana Varela, but it has been taken to a number of different directions. So I think it's important to see that the enactive approach comes then to be applied in a variety of ways. The original work by Maturana Varela was had its origins in theoretical biology, but there was a very clear practical orientation of the enactive project. And so one point is that the application in experimental and modeling research on minimal autonomous systems. So, for example, bacteria that I talked about, but also artificial living systems. There's a lot of research in this um, area that is inspired by an active understanding of, of the organization of living systems. Um, this notion of sense making that I've been talking about has given rise to a related notion of participatory sense making. Sense making that is in some sense social, right? So this has been used to address a number of social phenomena, including coordination in, right, in collective activities, for example, dance, but even linguistic communication. When we communicate with other people linguistically, right, we're engaging in some kind of participatory sense making. There's a lot of work on affectivity and emotion that draws from these enactive principles. There's work on skill and mastery of competences, which includes not only bodily competences, but what we could call abstract or conceptual competencies. They're also framed as aspects of embodied activity, right? Aspects of sense making and action from this kind of biological perspective. A lot of research on perception, action, tool use, and human-computer interaction, and applications in the domain of neuroscience as well. So, um, um, yeah, the enactive approach has this very practical orientation, even though it started in the domain of theoretical biology. And so, with this, it is a kind of a rough overview of key ideas in enactivism, but I hope you can see how it fits in this overall history, and it opens up avenues for research in contemporary cognitive science. How having identified those two traditions um, in the sciences of the mind, um, right, the internalist, mechanist, structuralist, computationalist, functionalist, we can see how the enactive approach falls in this tradition of a constructivist approach to explanation, right? A naturalist approach to observation and inquiry. It adopts a functionalist perspective in that specific sense of functionalism, and takes a dynamical and relational approach to understanding cognition. And so it fits in this um, version of embodied cognition that's what we described as radical embodied cognitive science. If you're interested in learning more, some additional resources I can recommend are books by Alva Noe, for example, Action and Perception. It's a 2004 book. There's Mind in Life by Evan Thompson, which um, I quoted some work by Evan Thompson here. Sean Gallagher does some work inspired by the research, coming from Matrona, Varela, and others. So he published this book, Enactivist Interventions, in 2017. The subtitle is Rethinking the Mind. And a more recent book that came out in 2020 titled Action and Interaction. Another book is the one by Ezequiel De Paulo and colleagues that came out in 2017 titled Sensory Motor Life, an Enactive Proposal. And more recently, in 2018, De Paulo, with different collaborators, published Linguistic Bodies, which is offers an enactive approach to language, to linguistic communication, and so on. And besides books, another resource that I wanted to recommend is the ENSO seminar series. ENSO is an acronym for Enactive Seminars Online, and it's this project led by Merrick McGann, who organizes these regular meetings where a researcher makes a presentation on their some topic of their work, and people can participate in real time through by sending messages and asking questions or interacting in video. And all of these are available archived online, so you can go and find, like, there are several videos from the past few years of a number of talks by many of these researchers that I've mentioned in this lecture today. So these are some suggestions if you want to explore more, dig deeper, and from these kind of this starting point that I provided you for understanding the enactive approach. So feel free to explore these and to get in touch also if you have any questions or comments.